Welcome to the Deep Dive. We love to explore philosophical topics here. And today we're going really deep, diving into the world of philosophical skepticism. But with a twist, we're focusing specifically on its history and development in Latin America. Now, for you folks who, like us, love getting to the bottom of these intellectual puzzles, you might think you've got a grasp on skepticism. But trust me, what we've discovered about its journey through Latin American philosophy, it's full of some seriously unexpected and thought-provoking insights.
You're spot on there. We've been digging into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and their entry on skepticism in Latin America is a goldmine. It gives this incredibly thorough account, tracing skeptical thought in the region from its roots way back to, contemporary discussions happening right now. And one thing that jumps out is this very different approach, setting it apart from the kind of skepticism you often see talked about in other philosophical traditions.
And that's precisely what we're aiming for today. Not just summarizing this entry, but truly digging into the core of it. How have Latin American philosophers not only engaged with skepticism, but in many instances actually embraced it? And they've even gone a step further, pioneering entirely new skeptical frameworks. For our listeners out there, we want to present a much richer, more nuanced picture of skepticism, one that goes way beyond what you'd find in, say, your typical introductory philosophy textbook. So let's break this down a bit. When we talk about philosophical skepticism, particularly to a philosophical audience, what are the fundamental ideas we need to keep in mind?
Right. Well, at its core, philosophical skepticism is really about suspending judgment. It's like the complete opposite of dogmatism, where you're making these firm assertions or denials about certain claims. A skeptic, though, they take a step back from making such definitive pronouncements.
So they're kind of saying, hold on, let's not be so quick to commit.
Exactly. And historically, skepticism has posed this fundamental challenge to the whole pursuit of truth in philosophy. Because if certainty is so slippery, what happens to these complex philosophical systems we build? And that's precisely why so many philosophers, across history really, have felt this urge to confront and try to refute skeptical arguments. They saw overcoming skepticism as this crucial step in validating their own philosophical positions.
Okay, so this is not just some passing fad or some obscure corner of philosophy. Skepticism has real historical weight behind it.
Absolutely. I mean, even in ancient times, skepticism showed up in two main forms. We had Pyrrhonism, which basically aimed for this inner peace or tranquility by suspending judgment on all beliefs. And then there was academic skepticism, which argued that knowledge itself is just impossible. And then, fast forward to the Renaissance, these schools of thought got rediscovered and became cornerstones of modern philosophy. Think of figures like Montaigne, Bayle, Hume. They breathed new life into these skeptical ideas. And it wasn't just a revival. Philosophers like Bacon, Descartes, Berkeley, Kant, they all wrestled with the skeptical challenge their own ways. And fast forward again to the 20th century and contemporary analytic philosophy, skepticism is still a central topic, one that's debated vigorously. It really shows this persistent intellectual grip that skepticism has.
So we've established skepticism as this firmly entrenched player in the world of philosophy. Now, the entry points to this intriguing observation, and that is that Latin American philosophers seem to have a particularly strong affinity towards skepticism. What sets their approach apart?
That's a really interesting point of difference. See, in many other philosophical traditions, skepticism is treated as this obstacle to be overcome, almost like a dead end you want to avoid. But in Latin America, many philosophers see it as a genuinely valid, even productive intellectual position. They don't necessarily see encountering a skeptical conclusion as a reason to throw out the whole argument. It's not an instant reductio ad absurdum for them.
So it's not seen as this philosophical poison pill that ruins everything that came before.
Precisely. And you actually find a lot of Latin American philosophers who openly embrace the label of skeptic. Even those who don't fully subscribe to skepticism dedicate a lot of energy to understanding its subtleties and its role throughout history. It's like they see some inherent value in that skeptical perspective itself.
That's a fascinating shift in emphasis.
Yeah.
So who are some of the figures who really spearheaded this more welcoming view of skepticism in Latin America?
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy gives a lot of credit to Oswaldo Porchat from Brazil and Ezequiel de Lasso from Argentina. They're considered the founding fathers of skepticism studies in Latin America. They got the ball rolling, you could say. It was their initial engagement with these ideas and their collaborations in the late 60s and 70s that sparked all this interest in research across Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia. They were the ones who put Latin American skepticism on the map.
So let's delve into their individual stories a bit. What drew them to skepticism in the first place?
Well, for Porchat, a turning point was a lecture he gave in 1968. He tackled this seemingly intractable problem of the conflict of philosophies. He was struck by just how persistent and seemingly unresolvable the disagreements were between different philosophical doctrines. And this was on just about any question you could think of. Now, considering his background in classical studies and his doctoral work, which was on Aristotle's philosophy of science, well, Aristotle was someone deeply concerned with the foundations of knowledge. So it's not surprising that Porchat found himself drawn to ancient skepticism as this framework for understanding and responding to this fundamental clash in philosophy. He saw in the ancient skeptics a way to acknowledge this deep conflict without just surrendering to dogmatism.
It's like he was searching for a way to acknowledge that disagreement is kind of baked into the philosophical process.
Yeah, exactly. And as for Olasso, his journey took a different route. His 1969 doctoral dissertation was all about Leibniz and the ancient skeptics. And what his research showed was that Leibniz had a pretty sophisticated grasp of Greek skepticism. And these skeptical arguments actually played a significant role in shaping how Leibniz engaged with Cartesian thought. And here's a fun fact. Olasso moved to Brazil in 75 at Porchat's invitation. And their partnership was amazingly fruitful. They organized these pivotal conferences on skepticism, bringing together scholars with shared interests. This fostered a collaborative intellectual atmosphere, one that still thrives today. It was their combined efforts that really established skepticism as a legitimate, vibrant area of philosophical inquiry in Latin America.
So Porchat and Olasso laid the groundwork, and the entry we're discussing highlights Neo-Pyrrhonism as this particularly important Latin American contribution. What makes this stand out as unique?
Neo-Pyrrhonism, largely developed by Porchat, is arguably the most significant, most original contribution to skepticism studies to come out of Latin America. It's not just about applying skeptical methods for very specific things, like Descartes' methodological doubt, for instance. Porchat presents Neo-Pyrrhonism as this whole philosophical stance you can genuinely live by, a way to engage with the world and with philosophical issues. It aspires to be a real lived option, not just a thought experiment.
So it's not skepticism as a tool, but skepticism as, well, a way of life.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, how does this differ from the kinds of skepticism that philosophers might be more familiar with, like Descartes' whole project of radical doubt?
That's an essential distinction. While Descartes used doubt as a tool, something to get him to a goal, like discovering the indubitable foundations of knowledge, Neo-Pyrrhonism doesn't necessarily share that ambition. It's not about doubting everything to find some bedrock of certainty. What's more, Neo-Pyrrhonism straight up rejects mentalism, the idea that you can think about the mind and its representations in isolation from the body and the external world. And as a result, it sidesteps the whole solipsism trap, the belief that only one's own mind is certain to exist. A lot of the standard criticisms you hear about Cartesian skepticism just don't apply to Neo-Pyrrhonism. It works with different assumptions and aims for a different philosophical outcome altogether.
Okay, so we've got a distinct form of skepticism here, with its own set of commitments and things it wants to avoid. What are the key pieces of this Neo-Pyrrhonist approach?
So there are two sides to it, a negative and a positive. The negative part centers around two concepts: diaphonia and epoche. Diaphonia is all about this constant, seemingly unresolvable conflict between philosophical doctrines across tons of issues. And epoche, that's the natural response to running into this undecidable diaphonia. You suspend judgment. And this is interesting. Porchat sees ataraxia, that's tranquility of mind, which is usually considered the ultimate goal in classical Pyrrhonism, as less central to his Neo-Pyrrhonist project. For him, it's the intellectual gridlock caused by diaphonia that primarily pushes us towards epoche. He even makes this useful distinction between two types of skeptical arguments. First, there are dialectical skeptical arguments, which use the dogmatist's own premises to undermine their conclusions. And then you've got empirical skeptical arguments, which use our everyday experiences of the world to make suspension of judgment seem reasonable. This really highlights the multifaceted nature of Neo-Pyrrhonist skepticism.
It's like they're using the dogmatist's own tools against them in a way.
Precisely. It's a very strategic approach to skepticism.
And what about the positive side of Neo-Pyrrhonism? What does it offer beyond just withholding judgment?
Right. So the positive dimension is built around this concept of phenomenon. That's what appears. Initially, Porchat connected phenomenon to fantasia, which is sort of like a mental representation or impression. But later, he refined this, increasingly linking phenomenon to paios. And that's common life, the shared world we all experience. So in this later understanding, what appears is essentially what we take for granted in our shared everyday lives. Porchat argues that these phenomena aren't things we choose to accept, they just impose themselves on us as part of life. And he emphasizes how crucial language is in shaping how we grasp these phenomena. He says they're impregnated by language rather than being raw, unfiltered data.
So if what we can know is limited to what appears, and these appearances could be relative, doesn't this lead us right back to solipsism, even though Porchat wants to avoid it?
Well, not necessarily. You see, Porchat stresses that many phenomena are intersubjective, meaning they can be personal to an individual, but they can also be public, shared by many, even everyone within a community. Like the sensory experience of reading these words right now, or the common understanding that Brasilia is the capital of Brazil, those are phenomena that are public and shared. This link between phenomena and our shared ways of life anchors neo-Pyrrhonism to a common world, mitigating that threat of solipsism. Also, Porchat points out that phenomena can be sensible, like when you perceive an object, or intellectual, like grasping a concept or a law. Often there's no clear-cut line between the two. Importantly, he separates dogmatic discourse, which claims to be about this mind-independent reality behind appearances, from non-dogmatic discourse, which simply expresses phenomena. It's much like our everyday language. So neo-Pyrrhonism can actually accommodate objective knowledge about the world, but it's objectivity grounded in how things appear to us within this shared framework of phenomena and language. It's not objectivity in the traditional metaphysical sense.
That's a really subtle but significant reframing of objectivity. And how do some of the other key ideas from classical Pyrrhonism, like heresis and zetesis, get updated in this neo-Pyrrhonist framework?
Right. Porchat offers interesting reinterpretations of both. He suggests that neo-Pyrrhonists actually do have a kind of skeptical view of the world. It's not a dogmatic theory, though, but more like a coherent way of articulating how things appear to them within their shared lives. And since many phenomena are intersubjective, this view can be pretty extensive, reflecting our common ways of thinking and acting. But it's still understood as an expression of phenomena, not a claim about some deeper independent reality. As for neo-Pyrrhonian zeticists, that's the ongoing process of inquiry. It's not solely about shooting down dogmatism. It also includes empirically exploring the world of phenomena. That means incorporating what we learn from science and potentially even accepting a form of scientific realism. That's accepting the reality of things science describes. But while doing this, you still maintain that skeptical stance towards philosophical realism, the idea of a reality existing independently of our minds and experiences.
It's like walking a tightrope between accepting what science tells us, but not taking that final leap into believing there's a mind-independent reality behind it all.
Precisely. It's a delicate balance.
So this neo-Pyrrhonism sounds like a pretty substantial original contribution to philosophy. How has it been received by other philosophers, both within Latin America and in the wider philosophical world?
It's definitely sparked a whole range of responses, as you might expect. Some philosophers, especially those invested in scientific knowledge like Ben Susan and Sousa, have voiced concerns. They worry about whether neo-Pyrrhonism can truly explain the progress and explanatory power of science. They felt it didn't have the right tools to grasp how science works. Dutra even put forward an alternative called alephic skepticism, arguing that you need a metaphysical notion of truth for scientific research to make sense. But others, like Bueno, have been more open to it. They've been trying to find common ground between neo-Pyrrhonism and current philosophical views on science.
So some pushback, but also some attempts at synthesis.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about those who are more in line with neo-Pyrrhonism? Have there been any attempts to refine it, expand on it, or even critique it from within?
Oh, definitely. A number of philosophers have tried to build on and refine Porchat's framework. For example, Smith has questioned whether some parts of neo-Pyrrhonism, like the idea of skepticism being a sort of therapy for dogmatism, might actually be hiding some sneaky dogmatic assumptions of their own. Silva-Filho has explored the skeptical problems that pop up in our everyday lives, areas he felt Porchat hadn't fully addressed. He's also tried to apply neo-Pyrrhonist principles to things like self-knowledge, and Barrio has zeroed in on the neo-Pyrrhonist take on truth, arguing that a deflationary theory of truth might fit better with the skeptical stance than the correspondence theory Porchat put forward. These internal discussions really show how dynamic and evolving neo-Pyrrhonist thought is.
It's great to see how a single philosophical idea can give rise to so many different lines of inquiry. And it's not even restricted to just epistemology. The entry mentions developments in political philosophy too, right?
Yes. Philosophers working in political philosophy started thinking about what it would mean to see things through a skeptical lens in their field. Now, Porchat himself suggested that a skeptic could theoretically hold any political view, since skepticism is mainly about knowledge. But others, like Lessa, have argued there's a natural connection between skepticism and liberalism. Piva has explored whether you can ground social democratic or socialist ideas in skeptical principles. And Araujo has linked skepticism to the very concept of citizenship, saying a healthy dose of skepticism toward grand narratives might be crucial for democratic participation. It just shows how broadly relevant skeptical ideas can be.
It seems skepticism has a way of sneaking into all sorts of unexpected places. And there's even internal debate among those who consider themselves neo-Pyrrhonists, right?
Absolutely. Philosophers like Schwartz and Machuca, they've been pushing for a more rustic or radical version of neo-Pyrrhonism. They say that to be truly consistent, skepticism, especially the kind that attacks dogmatism, should go all the way, reject all beliefs, not just the philosophical ones, but everyday beliefs too. They're essentially pushing the boundaries of skeptical abstention further than Porchat himself might have envisioned. It highlights this ongoing self-reflection and critique within the neo-Pyrrhonist school.
So there's a spectrum of skepticism even within neo-Pyrrhonism. And what about critiques from those who just fundamentally disagree with the whole neo-Pyrrhonist idea?
Well, there have been some significant challenges. Bolzani Philo, for instance, has argued that there might be some hidden dogmatic assumptions, a naturalized reason, if you will, within Porchat's idea of a healthy philosophy. This life lived in accordance with phenomena. He asks whether skepticism can ever fully escape that conflict of philosophies it's trying to address. And Saab Herrera, drawing on Kant, has raised concerns about the coherence of Porchat's idea of phenomena, suggesting that we might need a more robust transcendental framework to really understand our experience. So these are critiques aimed at the very foundation of neo-Pyrrhonism.
So neo-Pyrrhonism has definitely shaken things up in the philosophical world.
Oh, absolutely. It's generated so much discussion and debate.
Now, let's shift gears a little. The entry we're looking at also discusses contemporary skepticism in Latin America, specifically how it's interacted with analytic philosophy. How's that unfolded?
Latin American philosophers have been very engaged with the main themes and debates happening in contemporary analytic epistemology. That includes different responses to skepticism, like contextualism and externalism, and even the continued importance of transcendental arguments. But they haven't just been reacting to what's already there. They've also explored some really novel connections and interpretations.
Could you give us some examples of this engagement?
Sure. Marcanas de Sousa Filho, for one, has looked into the parallels between Pyrrhonism and Wittgenstein's philosophy of language, focusing on their shared concerns about linguistic dogmatism and the importance of context for understanding meaning. Then you have Samuel Cabanchik, who's made some significant contributions by exploring the idea of linguistic skepticism. That's skepticism about whether meaning itself is fixed and knowable, rather than skepticism about the external world. His work draws these really insightful connections between Wittgenstein, Aristotle, and the early modern skeptic Francisco Sanchez. This focus on language and meaning has been a big theme in how Latin American philosophers have engaged with skepticism within analytic philosophy.
And this link with Wittgenstein, it seems to keep popping up as a fruitful avenue of exploration.
Yeah, it really does. You've got scholars like Smith, Margutti, Reynoso, Holguin, and others. They've all pointed out the striking similarities between Wittgenstein's later work and ancient Pyrrhonism. They both critique traditional philosophical theorizing, they both emphasize the practical, contextual nature of our concepts, and they both see philosophy as a kind of therapy for dissolving philosophical confusion rather than building big systems of knowledge. Nudler even developed a philosophy of the limits inspired by both Wittgenstein and the Socratic idea of knowing that you don't know, a perspective that echoes those skeptical themes of intellectual humility and questioning dogma.
So Wittgenstein keeps coming back into the conversation, and the entry also mentions meaning skepticism, which comes from thinkers like Quine and Kripke. How have Latin American philosophers tackled these ideas?
Right, meaning skepticism, as it's been articulated by philosophers like Quine, Putnam, Dummett, and even Kripke in his Wittgensteinian phase, sometimes called Kripkenstein, raises these fundamental questions about meaning. Is it ultimately fixed, or is our use and understanding of language inherently uncertain? Latin American philosophers, folks like Satne, Modapinto, and Lazos, have been wrestling with these tough skeptical arguments that come from contemporary semantics. They're looking at the implications these arguments have for our understanding of language, thought, and knowledge itself.
It sounds like there's been a real back and forth about whether some of these major figures in analytic philosophy might actually be skeptics themselves, maybe even unknowingly.
Absolutely. Porchat himself argued that a good chunk of contemporary analytic philosophy, with its focus on the limits of knowledge and the complexities of language, kind of leans toward skeptical conclusions. But others, like Bolcaume, have pushed back against that, challenging the skeptical readings of people like Quine, for instance. And Latin American thinkers have examined the relationship between other key analytic philosophers and skepticism too, people like Davidson and Strawson. Scholars like Orlando, Barturin, Bueno, and Sanchez have looked at how these philosophers try to resist or work around skeptical challenges.
It's interesting how the conversation about skepticism in Latin America isn't just confined to epistemology in the analytic tradition. The entry mentions explorations in other philosophical traditions too, right?
Definitely. You have philosophers like Ben Salem, Sanchez, and Tecchio. They've looked at skeptical themes through the lenses of other traditions. They've engaged with thinkers like Cavell and Heidegger, focusing on those bigger questions about the human condition, the limits of understanding, and the finite nature of our knowledge. And they draw parallels between these existential concerns and more traditional skepticism about knowledge.
And what about this Mexican group? They're highlighted as proposing some new forms of skepticism, right?
Exactly. The Mexican group has been really active in developing these fresh, nuanced, skeptical positions. Cintorda, for instance, is advocating for a kind of Pyrrhonism specifically within the philosophy of science. He says that having a skeptical stance towards established theories can make scientists more open-minded and prevent them from getting too attached to dogma. Ornelas has provided some really sharp analyses of different anti-skeptical strategies that are popular today, arguing that they often miss the mark in responding to the fundamental challenges of skepticism. And then you have Hurtado, who's been focusing on fallibilism, the idea that our beliefs can be wrong. He says we need a more precise vocabulary for talking about different kinds and degrees of doubt and certainty.
Of course, it's not like all of Latin American philosophy embraces skepticism. The entry also mentions those who outright reject skeptical conclusions, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are philosophers like Ferreira and Sá Pereira who've argued against skepticism. They say it ultimately leads to things like idealism or just practical self-contradiction. Because if you're even asserting that skepticism is true, you're kind of committing to some form of truth or knowledge. Cresto has explored anti-skeptical strategies that come from naturalism and reliabilism. These frameworks emphasize how reliable our cognitive processes are as a basis for knowledge. Miroli has looked at scientific skepticism and the relevant alternatives approach, which tries to narrow down skeptical doubts by focusing on genuine possibilities for being wrong. And other approaches have been explored too, like the ethics of belief, epistemic responsibility that's been looked at by Hoyos and Posada, and then there's Davidsonian anti-skepticism as interpreted by Avila and Bueno, and contextualism, which Willages and Abath have been working on. They're all seen as ways to tackle and overcome those skeptical challenges.
And what about the transcendental strategy against skepticism? This one draws on Kant and Strawson and seems to be a big area of focus, especially for that Mexican group we were talking about.
Yeah, you're right. The Mexican group, with people like Stepanenko, Lazos, and Cabrera, has been deeply involved in exploring transcendental arguments as a way to refute different types of skepticism. Stepanenko has honed in on Kant's idea of the synthetic unity of apperception, basically arguing that for us to have coherent experiences at all, there have to be certain fundamental structures of understanding in place, structures that skepticism can't touch. Lazos has been trying to combine insights from both Kant and Wittgenstein in developing his transcendental anti-skeptical arguments. And Cabrera has given us these really detailed analyses of how effective different transcendental arguments are when faced with skeptical challenges.
Finally, there's the classic skeptical problem, the Agrippan trilemma. How have Latin American philosophers addressed that one?
Both Machuca and Bueno have engaged with the Agrippan trilemma. It basically outlines this seemingly inescapable problem. Any attempt to justify our beliefs seems to either lead to an infinite regress, circular reasoning, or just relying on some dogmatic assumption. Machuca has given us this really subtle analysis of the mode of diaphonia that's disagreement within the trilemma. He says it has unique features that contemporary understandings of disagreement often miss. And Bueno has defended the Agrippan trilemma against some recent criticisms, arguing that it's still relevant for understanding the challenges of justifying what we believe.
So we've seen that Latin American philosophers haven't just been passively absorbing skeptical ideas. They've actively wrestled with them, offered their own unique takes, and contributed a lot to ongoing debates. Now, the entry also provides a great historical overview of how skepticism has been studied in the region, looking at both modern and ancient skepticism. Let's start with modern skepticism. Who are some of the key figures there, and what areas have they focused on?
The historical study of skepticism in Latin America has been pretty extensive. Like global trends, there's been a lot of focus on the modern period, particularly figures like Descartes and Hume. But it also covers important thinkers like Montaigne, Bacon, Bayle, and Kant. Jose Raimundo Mayaneto's work stands out in this area. He's argued convincingly that academic skepticism was way more influential in shaping modern skepticism than we often give it credit for. He's done in-depth studies on a range of thinkers, from Montaigne and Charron to Descartes, Gassendi, Huet, Pascal, Bayle, and Hume, to back up this claim. His work has really reshaped how we see the intellectual lineage of modern skepticism.
And beyond Mayaneto's broader contributions, have other scholars zeroed in on specific figures or time periods within modern skepticism?
Yes, definitely. Luis Antonio Alves Iva has done some really deep analyses of Montaigne's Essays, which is a foundational text for early modern skepticism. He's also explored the complex relationship between Francis Bacon's philosophical project and skeptical thought, looking at the skeptical influences and how Bacon's idols of the mind were shaped by them. Then you have Renata Lessa, who's offered some insightful readings of Montaigne's political skepticism, highlighting how skeptical doubts about human nature and political knowledge can inform how we think about governing. Danilo Marcondes has done some fascinating research on how the discovery of the New World and the way it challenged Europe's established knowledge systems actually amplified the force of ancient skeptical arguments. And Cartesian skepticism has been a major focus for scholars across Latin America, with Oswaldo Porchat's skeptic Cartesian model and the contributions of scholars like Benitez, Robles, Margot, Gomez, and Zuluaga being particularly noteworthy. There's been great work done on 17th century French skepticism too. Loquet has examined the nuances of Christian skepticism, and Barr has focused on the influential figure of Pierre Bayle. And Berkeley's response to skepticism, along with Hume's complex relationship between skepticism and naturalism, have also gotten a lot of attention. Scholars like Robles, Conte, Charles, Plinio Juncker Smith, and Livia Guimarães have challenged the simplistic ways of interpreting Hume's thought. The connections between Kant's critical philosophy and skepticism have been explored extensively, especially by that Mexican group we talked about earlier, and by scholars in Brazil and Colombia. And there's a growing interest in skepticism's development in post-Kantian philosophy, too. Even the skeptical themes in 19th and 20th century philosophers like Nietzsche have been studied, showing how relevant skeptical inquiry remains across different philosophical traditions and eras.
That paints a very thorough picture of the engagement with modern skepticism in Latin American scholarship. What about ancient skepticism itself? Has there been a similar level of activity in studying it within the region?
Research on both Pyrrhonism and academic skepticism has been steadily on the rise in Latin America. Roberto Bolzani Filho has done important work looking at the relationship between these two main schools of ancient skepticism, pointing out where they converge and diverge. Diego Machuca has been a real champion for the study of ancient skepticism in Latin America, contributing a lot to our understanding of Sextus Empiricus's ethics and playing a crucial role in editing and spreading scholarship in the field. Colombia has also made some great contributions, with a Spanish translation of Sextus Empiricus's writings and insightful essays on ancient skepticism from scholars like Gutierrez. Ornelas has connected Sextus Empiricus's arguments to current debates in epistemology, showing how timeless those ancient skeptical strategies are. There's been interesting work on skeptical themes in Plotinus's philosophy and the influence of skepticism on early medieval thought. And Mauricio Boschot's research has highlighted traces of skeptical arguments and attitudes in medieval intellectual history. While maybe not as extensive as the scholarship on modern skepticism, the study of ancient skepticism in Latin America is definitely growing and becoming more and more significant.
It's fascinating to see how these ancient ideas continue to resonate and be actively explored in such diverse philosophical contexts. The entry even touches on this intriguing intersection of skepticism and literature in Latin America.
Yeah, there's been some really interesting work looking at how skeptical ideas show up and influence Latin American literature. For instance, many see the famous Brazilian writer Machado de Assis as a skeptic, with Montaigne being a key influence. Jose Raimundo Maia has a whole book on this topic, providing a detailed analysis of the skepticism in Machado de Assis's work. And scholars like Pinto and Krause have contributed to this discussion too. Pinto's research on the history of Brazilian philosophy has even suggested that there might be this pre-existing tendency towards skepticism in the region, possibly influenced by the early modern skeptic Francisco Sanchez. It hints at this deeper cultural resonance for skeptical perspectives in Latin American thought.
This has been an incredibly illuminating deep dive into the world of philosophical skepticism in Latin America. To recap some key takeaways for our philosophically inclined listeners, we've seen that Latin American philosophers have this unique and strong engagement with skepticism. They often see it not just as an obstacle to overcome, but as a potentially productive and even valid philosophical stance. They've come up with original and influential ideas like Porchat's Neo-Pyrrhonism. They've actively participated in and contributed to contemporary debates in philosophy, both within analytic philosophy and beyond, and they've made significant contributions to our understanding of the history of skepticism, from ancient times to the modern era.
Absolutely. And considering your deep interest in these philosophical ideas, I'm sure this deep dive has added something valuable, maybe even surprising, to your understanding of skepticism. Seeing how philosophers in Latin America have grappled with this enduring philosophical challenge gives us a richer, more nuanced perspective than we usually get. Their work really forces us to rethink the nature and importance of skeptical inquiry in the grand scheme of philosophy.
So here's something to ponder as we wrap up. Given this long-standing affinity for skepticism in Latin American philosophy, does this unique perspective offer a valuable lens for us as philosophers to approach those philosophical deadlocks we sometimes encounter? And what about those constant challenges of conflicting theoretical viewpoints? Maybe it suggests being more open to suspending judgment, not as giving up, but as a potentially productive, maybe even necessary stance for navigating the complexities of philosophical inquiry. We really encourage you to explore the thinkers and debates we've touched on today. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.